Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, intriguingly titled, What is the Purpose of the Finance Industry? A simple yet fundamental question, but one in which many disagree. No doubt most members of our audience today have differing views, as do practitioners, regulators, policymakers, and customers. Considering that an effective finance industry is vital to our prosperity, and we are certainly facing bleak economic times today, the answer to this question is vitally important. So fortunately, this morning we're privileged to be joined by David Pitt-Watson, who, based on his award-winning course at Cambridge University, will discuss the evidence on the purpose of the financial industry and how well that purpose is currently being fulfilled by our institutions. David is an investor and a leading thinker in the world of finance. He co-founded and heads the responsible investing activity at Federated Hermes, has chaired the UN Environment Finance Initiative, and sat on the boards of organisations as varied as KPMG, Oxfam, Nesta, and Oxford Analytica. David has also been a visiting professor at Cranford and Cambridge universities, where he is now a visiting fellow, and his books, published by Harvard and Yale universities, have been translated into 5 languages. As always, before we begin, some brief housekeeping points. I'm Charlotte Dorber-Ashley and I manage the FS Club here at CN, and I'd like to warmly acknowledge our very generous sponsors who enable us to continue to bring you a wide variety of thought-provoking content across finance, technology, and economics. The slides for this presentation are publicly available on our website and in the chat box, and the session will be recorded and available to watch on our website within 48 hours. We'll also be holding a 20-minute Q&A session after the presentation, so please use the GoToWebinar chat facility to send your questions into me, and then I can feed them into David. Now we've got the boring stuff out of the way, I welcome you to take the virtual floor, David.
Charlotte, thank you very much, and thank you all for attending this little talk. I'm going to start just with a question, and maybe if we can go to the first question. Look, what I'm going to try and present in 40 minutes is something that is distilled from the course that I teach at Cambridge, but there you might need to listen and study for 40 hours. But one of the questions that we ask is about the efficiency of the finance industry. And so I'm just going to ask this one to start off this talk, which is, how much more efficient is the finance industry today than it was 100 years ago? Is it much worse, a little worse, much better, a little bit better? What do people think? Let's see what the answer to that is.
Just leave that up there a few moments longer. Our members are usually pretty fast at answering these. Certainly intrigued to see what the answer is. Okay.
Okay, so we've got about a quarter of the people think it's worse than it was 100 years ago, and about 2/3 who think it's a bit better or much better. We'll come back to this question. Let's move to my first slide, and I'll summarize what I'm going to say, and then I'll say it, and then we can have some Q&A about it. So look, for most industries, their purpose is really quite clear. You know, the car industry is there to provide us with cars that will take us from A to B safely, at speed, in comfort. The drugs industry is there to provide us with, you know, chemicals that will cure our illnesses. Supermarkets are there to provide us with food that will keep us healthy, please our palate, and so on and so forth. But if you ask people about finance, you often get a very interesting discussion. In fact, most of the people I think who attend this seminar are finance practitioners, and I would suggest that you ask your neighbor this question after a couple of drinks and see what it is that they say about the purpose of the finance industry, because we don't define the purpose, and therefore we don't quite know whether or not the industry is doing its job well or not. And I'm going to argue in the next 15 minutes that that is potentially extremely costly to society, and actually to the industry and to us as practitioners in the industry as well. But before I do, because I am going to be critical in some of this, this little talk, I want to start with this slide. I don't know how many of you, no, previous slide, please. Can we go to the previous one? So this slide here, it's two people who are receiving a Nobel Prize. They're bankers. And they're receiving a Nobel Prize because they've taken thousands of people out of poverty. The guy on the right is better known, Mohammed Yunus, and Masama Begum, who was the chair of the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. They managed to produce a 90% improvement in the efficiency of lending of micro lending to poor women. And as a result, those women were able to gain access to capital and to pull themselves and their families out of poverty. Intriguingly, if you look back through the history of finance in the West as well, you often come across people who are now regarded as philanthropists. So the Trustee Savings Bank, for example, or the first pension, were started by ministers, actually, of the Church of Scotland. I come from Scotland, so I like to boast about the invention of these by Scottish people. They were invented by people who are now considered philanthropists. So why is that? It's because where finance is not there, there is a huge gap in provision. That poor people are poor because often they don't have access to capital. The people who first put their money in the Trustee Savings Bank were people who otherwise had no way to save money except to put it under the mattress or wherever it was where it could be stolen. The people who were in the first pension had no idea how their widows and orphans were going to be catered for should they die before they did. These are hugely important services. Indeed, to anyone that wants to be rude about the finance industry, I often ask them to suggest to me a rich country that does not have a sophisticated finance industry or a poor country that does have one. The finance industry is absolutely central to our prosperity. But if you start to ask people outside the finance industry to describe how the finance industry operates, you will be taken aback, I think. This is a study on the next slide, where it's from the Bank of England, where they asked British people to find one word to describe the finance industry. These were the words they came up with. The number one word was corrupt. Now, this is just extraordinary. So here is an industry vital to our prosperity, where people who can introduce a better financial services win Nobel Prizes for taking people out of poverty, and yet the number one a word they find to describe it is corrupt. By the way, when this was done of finance practitioners, their number one word was regulated. And I'll come back to that thing. But clearly we've got a great big gap here. And I think this is because we need to take a step back and think about purpose. So on the next slide, I just, I point out that today practitioners, regulators, and academics, they don't consider the purpose of finance as the starting point. I mean, they will say it's to serve the outside world, and there are various articles that have been written about this, some I think quite accurate, some a little bit off. But if you were to ask the academic community, they'd say, look, markets will get us there. Consumers come to markets, they ask for the things, suppliers supply them. And this is Bob Merton, he's a Nobel Prize winner in economics rather than in peace, which is what Mohammed Yunus got it for. Competition in markets will cause the changes in institutional structure to evolve towards greater efficiency. And that's where it stops. I think we need to go back again and have a debate about, what is it that we're trying to do with the finance industry? I would suggest that there are 4 absolutely vital things: that it needs to keep our money safe, that it needs to provide an effective payment system, that it needs to help us pool risk, which it does in all sorts of ways, most obviously through insurance, but also, and most importantly, intermediation. So it takes money from point A where it is to point B where it's needed, and that is an absolutely vital service. Indeed, I can't imagine how we are going to solve the problems of the 21st century, be that development or poverty or looking after people in old age or addressing climate change, unless we have the services of the finance industry to take money from point A where it is to point B where it's needed. And by the way, that's what bank accounts and pensions and loans and equities and stock exchanges, that's what they are all about. And the finance industry is accorded massive power to be able to do that. We also need electricity to address the problems of the 21st century, but nobody in a boardroom says, well, I can't do that because my electricity supplier wouldn't like it. They do say it because my shareholders and the finance industry wouldn't like it. So huge power in finance as well. But we don't start with the purpose of it. And I think I can demonstrate that that means that we don't get the purposeful finance industry that I would like. I mean, just on the next slide as well, just noting where do we start? We start with essentially in studying finance with neoclassical economics and statistics. For those of you who are interested in a particular sort of statistic, Gaussian statistics with normal curves that gives us value at risk and tell us how once every 200 years something is likely to happen or not likely to happen, but basically with a view that markets will get us there. Like Merton said, that competition in markets will lead to ever greater efficiency. So let's just put that one to the test. And there is a study which I've always found terribly challenging. It's by a guy called Thomas Philippon, who's a professor in New York, although he's French by birth. And he says, okay, let's start off and look at 2 things, and they're graphed on the next slide. First of all, how much has the finance industry cost in terms of the GDP? So here we've graphed the finance industry as a proportion of the GDP from 1880 until the current day. And as you can see, it's gone from about 2% of the GDP up to about 7.5%, 8% of the GDP today. So the finance industry has really been growing 2% to 8% of the GDP. But it's also been doing a lot more work. And that work is defined in Philippon's study as the amount of money that's intermediated as a proportion of the GDP. And if we went back to 1880, about 1 times the GDP was intermediated. You can see it on the scale on the right-hand side. And when we get to today, it's about 4 times the GDP, which is intermediated. So in 1880, people didn't have big pension savings, for example. Now they do. Quoted companies, there were fewer of them, they were worth less, they were doing less than they were, so more money intermediated. But Thomas Philippon has then taken these numbers and said, look, I can work out the efficiency of the finance industry from these numbers. Because if I look at the amount of GDP that the finance industry has taken up, that's the cost. And if I look at the amount of money intermediated, that's the value. So if I divide one by the other, I should be able to find what increase I found in productivity. So let's look at how he works out this productivity. It's on the next slide. The green line shows the raw cost of intermediation, you can see it's just about around 2% every year from about 1880 to today. And then he said, oh yeah, but look, we've now got lots more bank accounts and there's smaller amounts of money and we're lending to small companies as well as to big companies. Let's take all that into account and quality adjust the number. That's what you see in the orange line. It doesn't make it, it makes it a little bit better, but not that much better. The cost of intermediation today is actually about the same as it was 100, 120 years ago. And I do find that very, very challenging. And look, we can have lots of debates about whether these are the right numbers to be shown and whether there are some of Philippon's assumptions. But I think for those of you that were asking the answering the poll at the beginning, I certainly would have, before I read this study, I would have said the finance industry is vastly more efficient than it was. We've got computers and telephones and, you know, we used to be using carrier pigeons and we hardly had typewriters. I mean, you know, we have to be vastly more efficient. We're not vastly more efficient in terms of that if we just define it as that one critical service to the outside world. So why might this be happening? Look, here's some suggestions on the next slide. I think maybe there are some things that might be happening that are sort of zero-sum game activities, where you have two people taking other people's money and trading against each other to try and beat an index. That doesn't add value because for every gain there's a loss, and it's costly to play that game. I think it could be that there's lots of asymmetric information, so we know that markets don't work when one side of one side knows more than the other side does. So they can be missold. Yeah, so a quack doctor, for example, can sell you a remedy that absolutely doesn't work, and that's why we have lots and lots of things in medicine. It's not just regulation, it's cultures, it's structures, it's governance, and so on and so forth. That, I think, may be happening in finance. But if you have zero-sum game and asymmetric information and all of those sorts of things, it doesn't mean that your markets will not be reaching towards ever more efficient outcomes. And you see this in comments that people make. Adair Turner, you remember, was head of the FSA before it was split up. A lot of things that are taking place in the finance industry don't seem to be socially useful. Or Paul Volcker, absolutely marvelous financier and public service, talks about financial innovation as having vastly increased the rent. So that's the amount of money that's held back by the finance industry rather than what's given back as value to the customers of the finance industry. And by the way, it doesn't take bad people for this to be happening. It simply takes structures where markets can be, will come out with solutions that are not ones that are necessarily in the interests of their customers. I sometimes I've heard people compare it to early medicine 200 years ago. If you'd gone with a disease to the doctor, they would have taken your blood. It wasn't that the doctors were bad people, but taking blood was not curing people. And maybe there are things that we need to think about that take place in the finance industry, which are simply not useful. And maybe as well, we need to focus on those services of the finance industry which are important and which are not being served. And so, look, let me just finish with a couple of thoughts. One would be on the next slide of just the importance of all of this. I've worked for some of you may know, for the last 10 or 15 years on pensions in the UK, where we seem to have abandoned in the private sector the notion of a pension being an income for life, which is, you know, you retire and then you've got an income till the day you die and then your pensions run out. Actually, what we give people is a big check and say, look after it for yourself. If you create systems that look for incomes for life, which is what most people seem to want from their retirement income, you would create a pension system that on all the studies is 30–40% more efficient and more predictable than the one that we have right now. 6% of our GDP every year is saved in private pensions, and we can get a 30–40% productivity increase. So this can be absolutely huge in terms of a rethink of how it is that we design our financial services. And by the way, it's just on the next slide as well. I think that the UK, because I know most of the people listening to this will come from the UK, I think we could benefit from this. If I can just be nationalistic for a little while, this looks at the UK, the US, Germany, and France at the cost of intermediation. So it's the same study that you saw from Philippon. It's by a guy called Guillaume Bazot, and I commissioned this study from him. If you look, the UK is the solid line. We actually have got the lowest cost of intermediation. There are some fundamental things that we are doing right in this country. And I think a debate about purpose would be one in a post-Brexit world that might very much serve the UK well. But if we're going to do that, just a summary and stop and do some questions, Charlotte. What needs to happen? I think the first thing is we need to accept the evidence that Turner and Volcker may be right, that there is evidence that there's lots that's going on systematically in the finance industry that may not be purposeful. We need to go back to purpose and rethink the finance industry from that point of view, a paradigm shift. The starting point, therefore, in researching and studying and measuring finance and measuring risk needs to be different from where it is right now. The starting point for regulating finance, for example, you know, we've got a bill going through Parliament that wants to make the finance industry competitive. Well, that's a very neoclassical idea. I'd like it to be competitive as well, but I'd like it to be competitive for providing things that we know that society wants, rather than simply being good at making a profit. And so it affects the way that we practice finance. I say all of this, though, saying, look, when you do this, remember the baby and don't throw it out with the bathwater. I think Philippon is very, very challenging and should be very, very challenging to us as practitioners in finance. But we should not forget how fundamental a successful finance industry is to the prosperity that we all enjoy in this country and in many other countries, and make sure that as we reform finance and think about purpose, we get a better and better finance industry rather than just attacking it. And as I say, I now teach at Cambridge University. We have a course that this is a 20-minute summary of some of the things that we're looking at, and we're hoping to start a research center that would say, look, when we research finance, let's not dive down immediately a rabbit hole of neoclassical finance and Gaussian statistics. Let's start to think about what are the institutions that really make that work. So I'm going to stop there, but with one final poll. You can give us this, because I'd be interested to hear how the audience feel, which is, how seriously do you think finance practitioners need to think about the purpose of their industry? Is it very important, quite important, but lots of other things to think about? Or do you think that it's safe to allow that market forces will get us there? I'll be interested to hear your thoughts, and then we can have a bit of a discussion and some questions. Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm glad you think that, and I hope you will stay involved in this debate as we take it forward. And the interesting thing, Charlotte, is I often think when I talk to practitioners in finance, they do say that this is very important. When I talk to academics, they kind of say market forces will get us there. And I think if you've been involved in the finance industry, you can see all the other stuff that's going on. But until we've all got this new perspective, we won't be able to move things forward. And I guess that would be the point of my class and of the last 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, David. It looks like you've definitely convinced people here that we need to be thinking a lot more about the purpose. We do have quite a lot of questions. Trevor Hilder has said it's not possible to define efficiency without knowing what the purpose is. So that goes back to your fundamental point there. He's also said, has Grameen Bank not gone horribly wrong? And did not Merton's ideas lead to the LTCM fiasco?
Yeah, so you're right, you do need to decide what the purpose is. And by the way, the way we measure it right now is things like how much does it cost to trade a share? And if you do that, there's been huge productivity increases in the finance industry because it used to be done in copper plate writing and now it's done at a switch. But if you say, but the purpose is not to trade shares between people in the finance industry, it's to serve the outside world, you get a very different answer. There have been issues about Grameen Bank, and Yunus has become quite a controversial political figure. The question I think about the Grameen Bank was it so successful because it was given cheap money by people from the outside? And I think that might take out some of the positive things that it did, but I think the cost per person of taking people out of poverty nevertheless remained enormously low, as do some of the other good microfinance providers in the subcontinent and in Africa. Not all the microfinance providers are that good. I should also mention, but I think Grameen Bank's reputation, with some criticism, remains very positive. You're absolutely right that Robert Merton was involved in long-term capital management, and that the sums went wrong there, and they were based on Gaussian statistics. But he's still a professor at Yale or Harvard or one of those places.
Right. Well, going back to your point about the survey and the word corruption appearing so big there, Clive Bullen has said, isn't the problem the perceived wealth of finance professionals relative to the rest of the population? And how can that be addressed through better maths education, a better regulation of charges?
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think it is, and I think it's wealth where people don't understand why it was created. So, you know, we don't pay doctors badly in this country, and entrepreneurs who have created companies often end up being quite wealthy. People don't say that we're corrupt. I think there's an issue that people look into the finance industry and say, well, what is it that you're actually there for? What's your purpose? And the failure to be able to answer that question means that you get this notion of corruptness. And the definition of corrupt is to use the power that you have for your own self-interest rather than for its proper purpose, so the improper use of entrusted power. And if the finance industry takes other people's money, 2/3 of the money that comes into the finance industry from the UK is for pensions, for example. So it's entrusted to look after that money. It looks like it's doing all sorts of black box stuff, and a lot of people end up rich. That feels like the misuse of entrusted power for personal gain, and I think that is why you get that. And furthermore, I think we're still living through people looking at the global financial crisis and saying, not only did you make a lot of money, you also created a recession that we're still recovering from.
And on that note as well, Joe Zamet-Lucia asks, some say the purpose of finance has changed from providing the essential services we need to making as much money as possible for the finance industry itself. But that is not just a finance industry problem, it's indicative of the change in business.
Yeah, I think, Joe, that there is some sense of that. Perhaps though, the finance industry, because it requires a degree of expertise and it likes to be sort of black boxy, yeah, that it has that asymmetric information that I talked about that allows it to be able to do things that are in its interest and to make money, rather than always to be thinking about a people outside. And because it has that power, we need to think about the structures that mean that it exercises that power well. There's lots and lots of industries that are like this. Medicine would be the obvious one. I have absolutely no idea whether the treatment that the doctor is giving me is the right treatment. Even however long I go on the internet trying to study the particular condition that I've got, I have to trust the doctor. But my daughter is a doctor, and as I look at her education, boy, did she learn that you have to put the patient first. Absolutely extraordinary. And then there are all sorts of others, checks and balances within the medical profession. Maybe we could start to think about what might be similar relevant mechanisms and study how they work within the finance industry. That's the idea of what we'd like to do at Cambridge, not to find here's an arbitrage between two markets, but let's think about what are the processes that might work to make the finance industry ever more purposeful. And hopefully as well, that the result of that would be that people would say it was productive and that they were proud that the UK was the host of one of the most successful finance industries in the world.
I guess on that medicine point as well, you know, all medical practitioners need to make an oath to do no harm to their patients first. Maybe we should have finance practitioners do the same as well.
Interesting idea. I would buy that one. I would absolutely buy that one. You'd need to think about who it was that was doing it, but gosh, that would be. Imagine you did. Imagine you could have. Imagine the UK really was known quite explicitly for, you know, having the best financial services industry. If my money is in the UK, it is looked after properly. Gosh, that would be a really nice post-Brexit future for the finance industry.
Now going to sort of the financial services sector here, Shane Turnbull has said, would you agree that the excessive cost of the finance industry, that is now over 20% of GDP, could be reduced back to less than 5% as it was 100 years ago if the nature of money was changed? So it would only be a medium of exchange as proposed by Keynes, and not also a unit of value and store of value that grows like cancer from being able to earn interest. So simplifying money would be like a stamp script issued privately, like in the Great Depression by thousands of communities that was self-liquidating from the stamps needed to be affixed to it.
Okay, so I think there might be two questions there, Sean. I mean, there's one which is a very radical overhaul of the monetary system, where the finance system, in particular the banks, might not be the people who are creating money in the system. And I would be up for a debate about that. I sometimes think, though, that people can oversimplify how this works, and you just need to be careful how you did it. But your second question, which is the finance industry, about 8% of 20% of the capitalization of quoted companies, I think, but 8% of the GDP in the States and in lots of developed countries. Yeah, look, if we've had no productivity increase over 100+ years, you might have thought you could do the same job for a fraction of the cost. And people say, oh, well, that would be terrible, wouldn't it? Because then we wouldn't have a job in the finance industry. I would say that that's not what will happen. Usually when you reduce the cost of something, people buy more of it. I mean, imagine that we could find a way of really getting money to small companies, yeah, so that they really were properly financed at a fraction of the cost that they are right now. I think there'd be loads more entrepreneurship. There'll be loads more growth. If today the intermediation cost is 2%, Imagine if that was 1%. That would be like a 1% reduction in the real rate of interest. Gosh, how much would that stimulate an economy to grow? So I think actually that by thinking about purpose and getting a better product for finance for the outside world, that would be to the finance industry's benefit. And I think sitting where we are is problematic. One of the things I didn't talk about, which we could maybe discuss later, Charlotte, is about regulation, because I think what's happened as a result of all of this is we are massively over-regulated in the finance industry, and that's now adding to the cost just in and of itself. But we'll maybe come to that in another question.
Okay, now Nadine Rose has said, to understand purpose, is there a need to close the gap between financial practitioners and what life looks like in reality on the ground? Could we maybe use impact investing for that?
I mean, for sure. I think impact investing has got a considerable future, but there is a thing. I like to think of finance being something that does have impact. I mean, if I'm investing your pension money and you've got a secure retirement and you didn't have that before, that is having impact. And so lots and lots of stuff has got impact. But the finance industry as a bubble, gosh, yes. I mean, it is a bubble, isn't it? I mean, I don't think most people from the finance industry do get out and see as much of, or certainly from financial centers like London, for example. Lots and lots of finance, by the way, takes place in, there are banks and call centers, all of those sorts of things all over the world. They're just normal people. But I do think in the financial centers we could do to get out. One of my favorite economists in the UK is Andy Haldane, who was the chief economist at the Bank of England, now at the RSA. I've done quite a bit of work with Andy, but one of the things he used to insist that he did throughout the year when he was at the Bank of England was to go and visit places in the UK and see whether the economics that he had learned and he was trying to practice was actually working. If you went to Blackpool or Altrincham or all of these, and he would give these just wonderful speeches about just things that people had said to him that kind of demonstrated that the way that we were practicing economics wasn't reaching the places that we thought it was, because there were so many other considerations apart from classical economics that needed to be thought about. And so I'd strongly agree that trying to get people out there to try and think about the impact of what it is that they're doing, big step forward.
Yeah, I agree. Matthew Bell here has said, do you agree that the narrative since the Parliamentary Commission on Banking Standards about culture and purpose in financial services has been about the tone from the top, about the role of the firm, role of regulation, etc., when a more compelling narrative would be one of individuals developing as purposeful individuals, demonstrating the best in customer-focused, ethical professionalism, such as that promoted by professional bodies, and that change in emphasis from key stakeholders being firms, regulators, government, relevant trade associations would help increase professional pride amongst the workforce while increasing productivity as well?
Yeah, I would, and both are necessary, but I think as well you'd want a systemic change as well. This becomes very difficult if you have a situation where doing something that isn't purposeful is highly profitable. So those sorts of incentives needs to be profitable to do the right thing. If you don't do that and you've got a market system, then people who don't do the right thing will prosper. And therefore more people will want to do something that isn't the right thing. So I entirely agree. It's not just tone from the top, it's thinking about this from the bottom. But it's also about making sure that the rules of the game are ones such that the people who deliver to purpose are the people who prosper, and the people who don't deliver to purpose don't prosper. And I haven't I haven't started on this, Charlotte, because we've only got 40 minutes. That does raise some really difficult questions for the financial services industry, because there are some things I think that take place in financial services that are quite costly and are simply, we know that they are not purposeful.
We've got so many questions here, which shows how fascinating and stimulating this talk has been. We'll do one more, and then if we haven't got to your question, we will send them directly to David so he can get in touch with you over email. So Hugh Purser has said, going back to your early slide showing GDP, GNP contributions from 1880 to 2020, how much of global GNP do you think is from the so-called black economy, so unmeasured illegal activity?
Okay, I really don't know. The study, if you can get it on Google, is by a guy called Thomas Philippon, and it's entitled something like "As the U.S. Finance Industry Become Less Efficient." And then I commissioned some work from Guillaume Bazot for European countries. I'm not as entirely convinced as all these. Bazot needed to make quite a lot more assumptions, and I'm not quite as convinced as I would be of Philippon's work. But I don't know is the answer. If we're getting techie about this, there may be, for example, a bit of the finance industry that was taking place 120 years ago that was not counted in the finance industry. So if you read Portfolios of the Poor, for example, you'll see that where you don't have a finance industry, people invent it for themselves, and that wouldn't have been picked up. It'd be one of the criticisms of Philippon, but none that would push over his fundamental conclusion. But I don't know how much is in the black economy. I am pretty old-fashioned about bits of the finance industry that facilitate the black economy, but that's just somebody who was comes from Scotland and has got a grey beard.
Well, thank you so much, David. That was really, really enjoyable. And I do apologise if we didn't get to your questions. We will definitely send them to David so we can follow up. I think we almost need another webinar on this topic to delve a bit deeper, I think. So thank you very much to our sponsors as well for making these possible. We couldn't do these without you. And thank you so much for our audience for being so engaged and asking such intelligent questions as usual. So we do have plenty more events coming up before the end of the year, so do check those out on our website. If you want to get your mind around quantum computing in 20 minutes, we've got that on Tuesday the 6th, and we also have our last in-person roundtable for the year on unseen influences of climate change on sustainability at Birkbeck University. So do register on our website for those, and thank you very much everyone, and take care. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Bye.
Bye for now.